The year was 1934, and the sky was a vast expanse of pale blue that stretched endlessly from horizon to horizon, without a single cloud to break the monotony of the color or to offer a promise of shade to the parched earth below. The sun hung high in the heavens, a silent and unblinking eye that watched over the dry fields with a detached indifference, casting a heat that was not sharp or burning, but heavy and oppressive, a weight that pressed down on the shoulders of the world and slowed every movement to a crawl. The farmhouse stood in the middle of this vast dryness, a weathered wooden structure that had once been painted white, but was now stripped by the wind and the sand to the color of old bone, blending perfectly into the landscape of gray and brown that surrounded it on all sides. It was the season of the drought, the time of the great dryness, when the rain had forgotten how to fall, and the earth had forgotten how to yield, and the people had learned how to wait with a patience that was as deep and as enduring as the roots of the old oak tree that stood dead by the dry creek bed. Inside the house, the air was still and warm, carrying the faint scent of dry dust and old wood, a smell that was clean and ancient and utterly devoid of moisture. The curtains hung motionless at the windows, heavy fabric that had not stirred in days because even the wind seemed too tired to blow, or perhaps it was simply holding its breath, waiting for a change that showed no sign of coming. To sit in the rocking chair in the corner of the living room was the only sensible thing to do, a way to conserve energy and to pass the long hours of the afternoon when the sun was at its peak and the work in the fields was impossible because there was no work to be done. The fields were empty, save for the rows of withered corn stalks that rustled faintly when a breeze did manage to find its way across the plains, a dry scratching sound like paper rubbing against paper, a sound that was the voice of the famine itself, whispering of emptiness and scarcity. But inside the house there was no fear, only a quiet acceptance of the situation, a slowing down of the pulse to match the slow rhythm of the season. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked slowly and deliberately, the pendulum swinging back and forth with a heavy metallic sound that seemed to echo in the silence, counting out the seconds of the dry year one by one, without hurry and without pause. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was hypnotic, a repetitive beat that lulled the mind into a state of trance where thoughts became slow and viscous, like honey dripping from a spoon. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the gaps in the blinds, tiny galaxies of gray specks that swirled and floated in the stillness, settling slowly onto the surfaces of the furniture, coating everything in a fine layer of powder that softened the edges of the world. Dust on the table, dust on the mantel, dust on the floorboards, a constant reminder of the dry earth outside that was slowly reclaiming the house. Wiping the dust away was a futile task, a chore that had been abandoned weeks ago because it would only return within the hour. So the dust was allowed to stay, a guest in the house that required no food and made no noise. The scarcity of food meant that meals were simple and small, and the preparation of them took very little time, leaving the rest of the day open and empty, a vast stretch of time that had to be filled with sitting and staring and breathing. The pantry shelves were lined with jars of preserved goods from better years, glass containers filled with beans and peaches and tomatoes that glowed like jewels in the dim light, but they were rationed carefully, opened only when necessary, and eaten with a solemn appreciation. The hunger was not a sharp pain, but a dull ache, a hollowness in the center of the body that became familiar and almost comforting, a reminder that the body was merely a vessel waiting to be filled. The water in the well was low, deep down in the dark earth, and drawing it up was a slow process, lowering the bucket down into the blackness, waiting for the splash that sounded far away, and then turning the crank handle round and round, the rusty gears groaning in protest as the rope coiled and the heavy bucket rose slowly to the surface. The water was cool and tasted of minerals and earth, a taste that was precious and rare, to be sipped slowly and savored, held in the mouth for a moment before swallowing. Drinking a cup of water on the front porch in the shade of the overhang was the highlight of the afternoon, watching the heat shimmer rise from the ground in waving lines that distorted the view of the barn and the fence posts, making them look like they were made of liquid. The silence of the farm was absolute, not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, the absence of birds which had flown to wetter lands, the absence of crickets which had gone quiet in the heat, the absence of the cattle which stood motionless in the shade of the barn, heads low, waiting. The only sound was the occasional creak of the house settling as the wood expanded in the heat, and the dry rustle of the tumbleweed that rolled across the yard, pushed by invisible hands. To close the eyes and listen to the silence was to disappear into the landscape, to become dry and still and enduring, like the fence posts and the stones. The mind wandered to memories of rain, of days when the sky was gray and heavy with clouds, and the water fell in sheets, turning the dust to mud and filling the creek bed with a rushing torrent. But those memories felt like dreams now, stories of another life that had happened to someone else. The reality was the sun and the dust and the waiting. The rocking chair moved back and forth with a slight squeak, a rhythm that filled the room. Back and forth. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. Just wait. The concept of urgency had evaporated along with the moisture in the soil, leaving behind a world where time stretched out like the long shadows of the evening. The floorboards beneath the feet were bare and smooth, polished by years of walking, worn down to the grain of the wood, cool to the touch. A fly buzzed lazily against the screen door, a large black insect that threw itself against the mesh again and again with a dull thumping sound, searching for a way out, or perhaps a way in. It didn't matter which one, because both sides of the door were equally hot and equally dry. Watching the fly became a pastime, a way to focus the eyes on a single point of movement in a motionless world. Thump, buzz, thump, buzz. Eventually, the fly stopped, landing on the frame and rubbing its front legs together, resigning itself to the stillness just as the people in the house had resigned themselves. The afternoon wore on, the sun moving slowly across the sky, changing the angle of the shadows, lengthening them and softening the light from a harsh white to a golden yellow that bathed the room in a warm glow. It was the golden hour, the time of day when the heat began to break just a fraction, and the world took on a beauty that was melancholy and serene. The dry grass in the fields glowed like gold, the dust in the air turned into a haze of amber, and the weathered wood of the barn took on a deep, rich tone. It was beautiful in a desolate way, a landscape of survival where life had been stripped down to its barest essentials. The body felt heavy in the chair, the limbs lethargic, the eyelids drooping. There was no energy to read a book, no energy to sew a button, no energy to talk. Words seemed unnecessary in the face of such vast silence. What was there to say? It is hot, it is dry, we are waiting. These things were known and did not need to be spoken.
So the silence remained unbroken, a heavy blanket that covered the house and the fields and the people. The breathing became shallow and slow, matching the minimal exertion of the body. In, out, conserving moisture, conserving strength, conserving life. The thought of dinner was a distant concept, a small event that would happen later, but for now there was only the sitting. The hands rested on the lap, idle and still, the fingers relaxed, the palms open. These were hands that were used to work, used to plowing and planting and harvesting, but now they were forced to rest, to to lie dormant like the seeds in the dry ground. There was a strange peace in this forced inactivity, a release from the burden of productivity. There was nothing that could be done to make the rain fall, nothing that could be done to make the corn grow, so the burden of responsibility was lifted, leaving only the duty of endurance. To endure was to wait, and to wait was to sleep. The line between being awake and being asleep blurred, the conscious mind slipping in and out of a doze, catching fragments of dreams and mixing them with the reality of the room. A dream of a river flowing cool and clear, a dream of a green field waving in the wind, a dream of rain drumming on the roof. Then waking to the dry room and the ticking clock and the golden light. It was a gentle cycle, a slow drifting on a calm sea of heat. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange and red, colors that were vibrant and shocking against the pale blue of the day. The sunset was a spectacular show that played out every evening, a gift of color to compensate for the lack of water. Watching the colors shift and change was the evening entertainment, sitting on the porch and looking west as the ball of fire sank into the earth. The air began to cool slightly, not cold, but less hot, a relief that was felt on the skin like a gentle touch. The crickets, perhaps sensing the approach of night, began to chirp tentatively, a dry, rasping sound that fit perfectly with the landscape. Chirp, 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 a slow rhythm that replaced the silence of the day. The cows in the barn shifted their weight, their hooves clomping softly on the straw, a sound of comfort and presence. The house began to darken, the shadows claiming the corners, and then the center of the room, until only the windows remained as squares of fading light. It was time to light the kerosene lamp, a ritual of the evening. The match flared with a hiss and a smell of sulfur, the flame touching the wick and blossoming into a yellow tear of light. The glass chimney was lowered, and the light steadied, pushing back the darkness and creating a small circle of illumination. The smell of the kerosene was pungent and familiar, a scent of the night. The lamp cast long shadows that danced on the walls, shapes that looked like tall stalks of corn or trees waving in the wind, ghosts of the things that were missing from the land. The family gathered in the circle of light, faces illuminated in the glow, quiet and tired. The meal was eaten in silence, a piece of bread, a spoonful of beans, a cup of water. Simple food for a simple time. The chewing was slow, the swallowing deliberate. Every crumb was precious, every drop of liquid valuable. After the meal, there was no rushing to clear the table, no rushing to wash the dishes. Everything was done with a slow, methodical pace. The water from the meal was saved, used to rinse the plates, and then carried outside to be poured on the single surviving rose bush by the porch steps, a scraggly plant that clung to life with a stubborn tenacity. It was a small act of hope, a defiance against the drought. The night fully descended, covering the plains in a blanket of black. The stars came out, millions of them, sharp and bright in the clear, dry air. Without the moisture to haze the sky, the stars looked closer and brighter than ever before, a diamond dust scattered across the velvet of space. Looking up at them made one feel small and insignificant, a tiny speck on a dry rock floating in the vastness of the universe. It was a humbling feeling, a perspective that made the drought seem like a small thing, a temporary blip in the long history of the stars. The air outside was finally cool enough to be comfortable, and the family sat on the porch for a while, simply breathing in the night. The wind had died down completely, leaving the world in a state of absolute stillness. No leaves rustled, no dogs barked, no cars passed on the distant road. It was a silence so deep that it could be felt in the bones, a silence that was almost loud in its intensity. The fatigue of the day, of the heat and the waiting, began to take over completely. The body yearned for the bed, for the horizontal position, for the release of sleep. Moving inside the house was quiet, the floorboards creaking softly. The lamp was carried to the bedroom, the shadows moving with it. The bed was simple, a mattress filled with straw and covered with cotton sheets that had been washed thin. The sheets were clean and smelled of the sun, having been dried on the line outside. Lying down was a relief, the back relaxing into the mattress, the legs stretching out. The pillow was soft, the blanket unnecessary in the warm night. The lamp was blown out, plunging the room into darkness. But it was not a scary darkness, it was a restful darkness, a darkness that signaled the end of the waiting for one day. The eyes closed, the breathing deepened. The silence of the house was joined by the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sleepers. Outside, the dry earth slept, the empty fields slept, the dead creek slept. The world was in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the rain that would come one day, but not today and not tomorrow. For now, there was only the sleep, the deep, dreamless sleep of the famine time, a sleep that conserved energy, a sleep that passed the time, a sleep that healed the mind from the monotony of the blue sky. The clock in the hallway continued its vigil, tick-tock, tick-tock, marking the passage of the night. The sound was a lullaby, steady and reassuring. It said that time was moving forward, that the drought would end, that life would go on. But for the sleeper, these thoughts were gone, replaced by the heavy, warm blanket of unconsciousness. The mind drifted away from the dry fields, away from the empty pantry, away from the dust. It floated in a dark void that was cool and wet and silent, a place where there was no thirst and no heat, a place of perfect rest. The night dragged on, slow and quiet. The moon rose, a sliver of silver that cast a pale light over the sleeping farm. It illuminated the barn, the fences, the windmill that stood still against the stars. It was a scene of stark beauty, a black and white photograph of a moment in time. The dust settled on the roof, the dry grass whispered to the ground, the earth turned slowly on its axis, and the people slept. They slept through the midnight hour, through the small hours of the morning. They slept with the patience of stones. They slept because there was nothing else to do. And in their sleep, they were free from the famine, free from the worry, free from the waiting. They were simply being, simply existing in the dark, quiet heart of the dry country. The stillness was a physical weight, holding them down, pressing them into the mattress, keeping them safe. The night was a fortress against the sun, and inside the fortress there was peace, a dry, dusty peace, but peace nonetheless. The moon continued its slow arc across the sky, moving from the eastern horizon towards the west, casting a pale silver light that washed out the colors of the dry earth, turning the brown fields to gray and the weathered wood of the fences to a ghostly white, while the silence deepened with every passing hour, settling over the land like a heavy quilt that stifled all sound and movement. Beyond the sleeping house, the barn stood as a massive shape of timber and shadow that held within it a quietness even more profound than the night outside, because it was the quietness of emptiness, of a space that had once been full of life and noise, but now was hollow and waiting. The large double doors of the barn were closed shut, tight against the wind and the dust, their iron hinges rusted into place, fixed in a position of permanent closure. Approaching the barn in the stillness of the night, one could hear the faint groaning of the wood as it cooled down from the heat of the day, the timbers contracting with microscopic movements that sent tiny vibrations through the structure, a settling of the bones of the building. Inside, the air was thick and still, smelling of old hay and dried manure, and the lingering scent of animals that had long since been sold or moved to better pastures.
The darkness inside was absolute, a black void where the eyes strained to find purchase, but found nothing, only the feeling of space and the knowledge of the high rafters overhead, where the swallows used to nest, but where now only the dust motes drifted in the stagnant air. The loft where the hay bales used to be stacked high was now a vast empty platform, the floorboards covered in a layer of fine grit that had blown in through the cracks in the siding. A single rope
hung from a beam, swaying ever so slightly in a draft that no one could feel, a pendulum marking the center of the hollow space. In the corner, an old plow sat rusting, its metal blades dull and pitted, a relic of a time when the earth could be turned and planted, when the soil was dark and moist and yielded a harvest. Now the plow was just another shape in the dark, a cold piece of iron resting on the dry dirt floor. The silence in the barn was different from the silence in the house. It was a hollow silence, an echoey silence, where a single cough or a footstep would have rung out like a gunshot. But there were no footsteps and no coughs, only the slow breathing of the building itself. Next to the barn stood the grain silo, a tall cylinder of corrugated metal that reached up towards the moon like a finger pointing at the dry sky. It was empty too, its metal belly resonating with a low hum whenever the wind brushed against its sides, a sound that was more felt than heard, a vibration that traveled through the ground. The metal was cool to the touch now, having lost the scorching heat of the afternoon, and it stood as a monument to the harvest that had not come. Inside the silo, the darkness was circular and confining, the air smelling of metallic dust and the ghost of wheat. A mouse scurried across the metal floor, its tiny claws making a scratching sound, scritch, 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 that was swallowed up instantly by the vastness of the empty container. The mouse stopped and sniffed the air, its whiskers twitching, finding nothing of interest in the barren space, and then moved on, disappearing into a crack in the foundation, leaving the silo to its vigil. The wind began to pick up slightly outside, not a strong wind, but a steady breeze that moved across the flat plains without obstruction, pushing the tumbleweeds along the fence lines and stirring the dust into low clouds that drifted like ground fog. The sound of the wind was a soft hiss, a sibilant whisper that passed through the dry grass and the barbed wire fences, playing a mournful tune on the landscape. It was the voice of the drought, a dry and raspy voice that spoke of thirst and endurance. The dust carried by the wind hit the side of the barn with a sound like fine sandpaper rubbing against wood, a gentle abrasion that was slowly wearing the world down. Sand against paint, sand against glass, sand against metal. The friction was constant and slow, a geologic process happening in real time. Following the path of the wind away from the barn and past the empty cattle pens, the old dirt road stretched out into the distance, a ribbon of pale earth that led towards the horizon. The road was rutted and hard, the tracks of tires baked into the surface like fossils, evidence of journeys taken long ago. Walking down this road in the imagination was a slow and solitary journey, placing one foot in front of the other, observing the stillness of the roadside, where the sunflowers stood with their heads bowed low, dry and brittle, rattling their seeds in the breeze. A mile down the road stood the old schoolhouse, a small rectangular building made of white clapboard that had grayed with age and neglect. It sat on a small rise of land, a lonely outpost of learning in the middle of the empty fields. The playground out front was silent, the swing set standing like a skeleton against the sky, the chains of the swings hanging straight and still, rusting in the dry air. There were no children here, no laughter, no ringing of the bell, only the wind and the moonlight and the dust. The windows of the schoolhouse were dark, staring out at the plains like blind eyes, reflecting nothing. Inside the schoolhouse, the air was trapped, preserved from the last time the door had been closed. Rows of wooden desks sat in perfect formation, facing the front of the room, their surfaces scarred with initials and ink stains, but now covered in a uniform layer of gray dust. The dust was thick here, undisturbed by any current of air, lying soft and heavy on the wood. The chalkboard at the front of the room still bore the faint traces of a lesson erased long ago, white chalk dust grounded into the slate, ghost words that could no longer be read. A map of the world hung on the wall, pulled down to reveal the continents and the oceans, the paper yellowed and curling at the edges, the blue of the oceans faded to a pale gray, as if even the water on the map had dried up. The globe on the teacher's desk was covered in dust, the axis tilted, representing a world that had stopped spinning. The silence in the schoolhouse was a heavy silence, a silence of potential that had been paused, a silence of waiting for a bell that would not ring. A fly lay dead on the windowsill, a small black speck against the white paint, perfectly preserved in the dry air. The floorboards creaked as the temperature dropped, the wood shrinking in the cold of the night, a sound that was startlingly loud in the quiet room. Creak, wait, creak. The building was settling, shifting its weight, adjusting to the emptiness. In the corner, a small bookshelf held a few tattered readers, their covers worn and soft, the pages smelling of vanilla and age. Stories of green forests and flowing rivers locked away inside the books, waiting to be read, but there was no one to read them. The moonlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long rectangles of pale light onto the floor, illuminating the dust motes that hung suspended in the air. These dust motes did not dance like the ones in the house. They hung motionless, frozen in time, a three-dimensional snapshot of the atmosphere. To sit at one of the small desks in the dark, to rest the head on the folded arms, to close the eyes and listen to the wind outside, this was the essence of peace. There was no homework to do, no lessons to learn, no tests to take. There was only the quiet room and the smell of chalk and old wood. The feeling of the hard wood of the seat was grounding, a solid reality in a world of drifting dust. The mind slowed down, matching the stillness of the room. Thoughts became simple and unhurried. The wind outside, the dust on the desk, the moon in the sky, these were the only things that mattered. The connection to the outside world felt broken, severed by the miles of empty fields and the blanket of silence. Here in the schoolhouse, time did not move in seconds and minutes, but in seasons and cycles. The cycle of the dust, the cycle of the wind, the cycle of the decay. It was a slow decomposition, a gentle returning to the earth, the paint peeling from the walls in slow motion, falling in tiny flakes to the floor, the nails rusting in the wood, the paper fading. It was all happening so slowly that it looked like nothing was happening at all. And that was the comfort of it, the lack of event, the lack of change. It was a place where one could rest and know that nothing would be different when one woke up. The wind sighed around the eaves of the schoolhouse, a lonely sound that seemed to wrap the building in a hug of air. A tumbleweed rolled across the playground, bouncing softly against the slide, making a hollow clunk sound before rolling on into the night. Clunk, roll, clunk, roll. The sound faded away, leaving the silence even deeper than before. The night was at its midpoint, the darkest and quietest hour. The stars wheeled overhead, a slow procession of light. The Milky Way was a river of white dust across the sky, a mirror of the dusty road below. It was a universe of dust above and below, and the schoolhouse was a tiny boat floating in the middle of it all. To drift in this boat was to drift into sleep. The heavy eyelids could no longer be held open. The head felt heavy on the arms. The breathing became deep and rhythmic, echoing the slow pulse of the night. Sleep came not as a sudden event, but as a slow tide, rising gently, washing over the feet, then the legs, then the body, until everything was submerged in the warm, dark water of unconsciousness.
There were no nightmares here, no monsters, no fears. Only the vast, empty peace of the drought. The schoolhouse stood guard over the sleeper, a silent sentinel in the night. The barn stood guard in the distance. The silo stood guard, all the empty structures watching over the sleeping land. The wind continued to blow, moving the dust, moving the air, moving the world slowly forward towards the dawn. But the dawn was hours away, a distant promise that did not need to be considered yet. For now, there was only the night, the long, dry, quiet night. The dust settled on the roof of the schoolhouse, adding another microscopic layer to the history of the building. A spider spun a web in the corner of the ceiling, moving with slow, deliberate motions, creating a pattern of silk that was invisible in the dark. Usefulness in the midst of emptiness, life continuing in the small, dark corners. The web was a masterpiece of engineering, built to catch nothing, for there were no flies, but built nonetheless because that is what spiders do, just as the sleeper slept because that is what people do. The cycle continued. The earth cooled, the wind blew, the silence held. It was a perfect stasis, a moment of balance between the heat of the day and the heat of the tomorrow, a valley of cool darkness. To rest here was to be restored, to gather strength for the waiting that would begin again with the sun. But the sun was far away, on the other side of the world, shining on oceans and jungles and cities. Here there was only the Dust Bowl night, the great American silence, the sleep of the earth, the breathing of the wind, the stillness of the stars. Deep down in the ground, the roots of the sleeping plants waited. Deep down in the well, the water waited. Everything waited. And in the waiting, there was rest, profound and absolute rest. You stopped to look at a potter's wheel sitting silent in the corner, a heavy stone flywheel at its base, and a wooden seat polished smooth by years of use. You can imagine the rhythmic thumping of the kick wheel, the wet slap of clay, the spinning motion that creates form out of nothing. But tonight, everything is absolutely still, waiting in the quiet dark. You walk towards the back of the room where the shelves are stacked high with wooden molds and carving tools, their metal tips dull and resting. There was a sense of suspended time here, as if the potter just stepped out for a moment 100 years ago and never returned. You see a row of large clay jars on a lower shelf, each one sealed with a heavy cork stopper. You kneel down, your knees resting comfortably on the dusty floor, and you reach out to the third jar from the left, a heavy, round vessel with a rough, unpolished texture. You pull the cork, the dry sound echoing softly in the room like a whisper, and you tilt the jar to look inside. It is empty of water or wine, but at the very bottom there rests a small folded piece of soft leather. You reach in and pull it out, the leather worn and pliable, tied with a thin strip of rawhide. You untie the knot slowly, your fingers moving without haste, focusing entirely on the sensation of the leather against your skin. You unfold the pouch to reveal a small silver coin, ancient and worn smooth by many hands, with the faint image of a wheat stalk on one side. This is the treasure of the potter, a token of harvest and earth, hidden away in a vessel of clay for safekeeping. You hold the coin in your palm, feeling its coolness against your skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room. You fold the leather back over the coin, tying the knot securely with a slow, deliberate motion, and place it back into the jar, replacing the cork with a firm twist that seals the silence inside. You stand up slowly, feeling the warmth of the kiln radiating against your back, relaxing the muscles in your spine, making your legs feel heavy and loose. You walk over to an old armchair in the corner of the room, covered in a dusty woven throw rug that smells of dried sage. You sit down, the chair creaking softly under your weight, and you settle into the cushions, feeling the dust motes dancing in the air around you, illuminated by the faint orange glow of the kiln. The smell of the clay is hypnotic, the scent of the earth itself, grounding and heavy and real. You watch the faint glow from the kiln, a steady, unblinking eye in the darkness that promises warmth and safety. The heat seeps into your bones, deeper and deeper, making your eyelids feel incredibly heavy. Your breathing slows down,
matching the stillness of the room. In and out, slow and deep. You are a vessel of clay yourself, sitting on the shelf, drying slowly, hardening, becoming still and silent. The world outside is forgotten. The noise and the rush are gone, leaving only the warmth, the dust, the silence, and the heavy, comforting weight of sleep pressing down on your eyes, closing them gently, sealing you into the quiet, warm, earthy dark. The warmth of the pottery studio stays with you as a gentle memory as you step out into the cool night, the air fresh and smelling faintly of dew and pine. You walk along a narrow dirt path that winds away from the town, the ground soft beneath your boots, lined on both sides by tall hedges of lavender that release a calming scent as you brush past them. The path leads you towards a small, solitary cottage made of white stone with a thatched roof that hangs low over the windows like a sleepy eyelid. You approach the wooden door, which is painted a soft, faded blue, and you lift the latch, the metal smooth and worn under your thumb. The door opens with a hushed creak, inviting you into a room that is filled with the softest textures imaginable. You step inside, and the air is filled with the smell of raw wool, lanolin, and cedar wood, a cozy and organic scent that makes you feel instantly safe. The room is dimly lit by a few candles placed on shelves, their flames flickering gently, casting long dancing shadows on the walls, which are hung with tapestries of green and gold. In the center of the room stands a large, ancient wooden loom, a masterpiece of craftsmanship made from dark walnut wood, polished by generations of hands. You walk towards it, your footsteps silent on the thick hand-woven rugs that cover the floorboards in layers of warmth. You reach out and touch the frame of the loom, feeling the solid, cool wood, and you notice the shuttle resting on the warp threads, a smooth, boat-shaped piece of wood that has traveled back and forth 1,000,000 times. You sit down on the weaver's bench, which is wide and comfortable, worn smooth in the center. You can imagine the rhythmic sound of the loom, the click-clack of the beater, the swish of the shuttle, a hypnotic music of creation that settles the mind. To your right, there is a large wicker basket filled to the brim with unspun wool, clouds of white and gray fleece that looks soft enough to sleep on. You reach into the basket, your hand sinking deep into the softness, the lanolin making your skin feel smooth. Your fingers brush against something solid, hidden deep within the fluff of the wool. You move the fleece aside gently, revealing a small wooden box made of cherry wood, its surface inlaid with a pattern of vines. You lift the box out of the basket, the wood light and warm in your hand. You slide the lid open, the movement silent and smooth. Inside, resting on a bed of red velvet, is a silver thimble, tiny and perfect, engraved with a ring of microscopic flowers around the base. This is the treasure of the weaver, a token of harvest and earth, hidden away in a vessel of clay for safekeeping. You hold the coin in your palm, feeling its coolness against your skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room. You fold the leather back over the coin, tying the knot securely with a slow, deliberate motion, and place it back into the jar, replacing the cork with a firm twist that seals the silence inside. You stand up slowly, feeling the warmth of the kiln radiating against your back, relaxing the muscles in your spine, making your legs feel heavy and loose. You walk over to an old armchair in the corner of the room, covered in a dusty woven throw rug that smells of dried sage. You sit down, the chair creaking softly under your weight, and you settle into the cushions, feeling the dust motes dancing in the air around you, illuminated by the faint orange glow of the kiln. The smell of the clay is hypnotic, the scent of the earth itself, grounding and heavy and real. You watch the faint glow from the kiln, a steady, unblinking eye in the darkness that promises warmth and safety. The heat seeps into your bones, deeper and deeper, making your eyelids feel incredibly heavy. Your breathing slows down, matching the stillness of the room. In and out, slow and deep. You are a vessel of clay yourself, sitting on the shelf, drying slowly, hardening,
becoming still and silent. The world outside is forgotten. The noise and the rush are gone, leaving only the warmth, the dust, the silence, and the heavy, comforting weight of sleep pressing down on your eyes, closing them gently, sealing you into the quiet, warm, earthy dark.
The smell of the cedar and the wool is heavy and sweet, lulling you into a state of absolute relaxation. You are just another thread in the great tapestry, held safe, held tight, woven into the quiet night. Your eyes begin to close, the weight of the eyelids too much to resist. You drift away from the cottage, away from the loom, sinking into the softness, into the warmth, into the deep, textureless void of sleep that welcomes you with open arms. The soft comfort of the weaver's cottage fades slowly into the distance, leaving only the faint scent of cedar as a memory, and you find yourself standing on a narrow, winding street paved with smooth gray stones that glisten under the light of a single gas lamp. The air here is crisp and smells of dried earth and peppermint, a sharp and clean scent that clears your mind. You walk towards a shop with a large bay window filled with colored glass bottles that catch the light, turning it into beams of amber, cobalt, and emerald green. You push open the heavy wooden door, which groans softly on its hinges, and you step into an old apothecary, a sanctuary of healing and silence. The air inside is thick and aromatic, a complex blend of dried sage, lavender, chamomile, and cinnamon, a smell that feels ancient and medicinal, seeping into your lungs and relaxing your chest. The walls are lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of small wooden drawers, each one labeled with a handwritten tag in fading black ink, bearing names of roots and flowers from long ago. There are shelves filled with glass jars containing dried leaves, powders, and seeds, creating a mosaic of earth tones, browns, greens, and yellows. You walk slowly to the large oak counter at the back of the shop, the wood stained dark by centuries of spilled tinctures and oils. On the counter sits a heavy marble mortar and pestle, resting silent and still. You reach out and run your hand along the cool, smooth stone of the mortar, imagining the rhythmic grinding sound it would make. Grind, 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 a repetitive motion that turns rough leaves into soft powder. You walk behind the counter to a section of shelves that hold the most precious ingredients. You are looking for a specific jar, one that is tucked away in the shadows of the bottom shelf. You kneel down, your movements slow and deliberate, and you find a jar made of thick, frosted glass with a stopper made of cork. You pull the cork, the sound a soft pop in the quiet room, and you tilt the jar gently. Inside, resting on a bed of dried rose petals, is a small crystal vial, no bigger than your finger, filled with water from a pure mountain spring, sealed with wax. This is the treasure of the apothecary, a captured essence of purity and clarity, hidden among the dried roots. You hold the vial up to the light, watching the water inside, perfectly clear and still, a tiny universe of peace. You place the vial back into the jar, nesting it safely among the rose petals, and you replace the cork, sealing the scent and the silence inside. You stand up and walk to an old leather chair in the corner of the shop, the leather cracked and worn, inviting you to rest. You sit down, sinking into the deep seat, feeling the chair support your back and your arms. The smell of the herbs is heavy and intoxicating, a natural sedative that weighs down your eyelids. You watch the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window, moving in slow, lazy circles.
The silence of the shop is profound, a heavy, comfortable silence that wraps around you like a warm cloak. You feel your breathing deepen, inhaling the scent of lavender and sage, exhaling the tension of the day. The rows of bottles and drawers blur into a soft pattern of colors, the room darkening gently as if the shop itself is closing its eyes. You are safe here, surrounded by the healing power of nature, hidden away in this quiet corner of the world. You let go of the last thread of wakefulness, drifting down, down, down into the aromatic dark, into the deep, restorative and dreamless sleep that awaits you. The steam from the broth finally vanished completely, leaving the surface of the liquid still and mirror-like, reflecting the dim gray light of the window, and the afternoon settled into a rhythm that was even slower than the morning, if such a thing were possible. The rain outside had shifted from a drizzle to a steady downpour, a vertical curtain of water that washed the world in a relentless cleansing tide, making a sound like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping against the roof and the glass and the brickwork of the house. To look out the window was to see a world transformed into an impressionist painting of slate and charcoal, where the trees were merely dark smudges against the sky, and the street was a river of reflecting cobblestones. The house across the way, usually a sturdy brick structure with white shutters, now seemed to be melting into the gloom, its edges softening and blurring until it looked like a phantom building that might disappear altogether if one blinked too long. The silence inside the room was deepening, becoming a physical presence that filled the corners and the spaces between the furniture, pressing gently against the ears like a soft pair of hands. It was the perfect time to pick up the book that had been lying neglected on the small round table, a heavy tome bound in cracked brown leather that smelled of old libraries and dry parchment. The title on the spine was faded almost to illegibility, gold letters that had lost their luster decades ago, spelling out a treatise on the flora of the northern counties, a subject of such profound dryness that it was the perfect companion for a rainy afternoon in a sick room. Opening the cover produced a dry, crackling sound, the protest of a binding that had not been flexed in years, and the pages turned with a soft rustle, revealing columns of dense type and intricate woodcut illustrations of ferns and mosses. Reading the text required a squinting of the eyes in the failing light, but the words were of little consequence, merely a stream of Latin names and botanical descriptions that flowed through the mind without leaving a trace. We read of the Polysticum aculatum and the Blechnum spicant, the hard shield fern and the hard fern, descriptions of fronds and spores and rhizomes that were as dry as the paper they were printed on. The act of reading became a mechanical process, the eyes tracking left to right, the brain registering the shapes of the letters but not the meaning of the sentences, creating a hypnotic loop that pushed the consciousness further and further away from the waking world. The descriptions of soil types and shade requirements were a lullaby written in ink, a monotone chant that spoke of the slow and quiet life of plants, a life that was lived in silence and stillness, much like the life in this room. The paper felt rough under the fingertips, a tactile sensation that grounded the body, while the mind wandered through imaginary forests of gray and green, where it was always raining and the ferns grew tall and silent. Turning the page was a major event in the stillness, the sound distinct and crisp before being swallowed up again by the ambient noise of the rain.
The invalid in the bed shifted slightly, a rustle of linens that caused a momentary pause in the reading, but the breathing resumed its steady cadence, deep and rhythmic, and the vigil continued undisturbed. The light in the room was growing dimmer as the afternoon wore on,
the gray of the window deepening to a bruised purple, suggesting that the sun was setting somewhere behind the thick blanket of clouds, though it had never really been seen all day. It was too early to light the lamp again, to disturb the shadows that had gathered so comfortably in the room, so the reading was abandoned, the book left open on the knee, the eyes resting instead on the pattern of the rug on the floor. It was a Persian rug, old and threadbare in places, with a complex geometric design in shades of deep red and navy blue and faded cream, a maze of lines and shapes that offered an endless path for the gaze to follow. Tracing the border of the rug with the eyes became a new game, a slow journey around the perimeter of the rectangle, noting the wear in the corners and the way the fringe lay tangled on the floorboards. The house settled around the silence, the wood contracting as the temperature dropped slightly, a series of soft pops and creaks that sounded like the house was stretching its joints after a long sleep. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, a deep, resonant bong that traveled up through the floorboards and vibrated in the soles of the feet, a reminder that time was still passing, even if it felt like it had stopped. The air in the room was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of the broth and the old book and the damp earth from outside, a mixture that was specific to this time and this place. The sensation of the chair was one of total support, the back high and firm, the cushion soft and yielding, holding the body in a posture of relaxed attentiveness that required no effort to maintain. The eyelids felt heavy, as if small weights had been attached to the lashes, dragging them down towards the cheeks, urging the eyes to close and the mind to rest. It would be so easy to drift off, to let the chin drop to the chest and join the invalid in the land of sleep, to let the rain wash away the last vestiges of consciousness. But the duty of the watchman was to stay awake, to bear witness to the silence and the waiting, so the eyes were forced open again, blinking against the gloom, focusing once more on the gray square of the window. A single drop of water traced a path down the glass, meandering left and right, merging with other drops, gathering speed before hitting the sill and disappearing, a tiny drama played out in silence. Watching the raindrops became a meditation, a way to empty the mind of all thought and simply exist in the moment, observing the natural world in its slow and repetitive motion. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the branches of the elm tree outside to sway gently, a slow dance of black limbs against the gray sky, a movement that was soothing and hypnotic. The world outside was a study in grayscale, a photograph developed in low light, where the details were lost in the shadows and only the broad strokes remained. There were no people to be seen, no carriages, no horses, only the rain and the wind and the empty street, a stage set for a play that had finished long ago. The feeling of isolation was complete, a sense of being cut off from the rest of humanity, of existing in a bubble of time and space that was separate from the bustling world of commerce and industry. And in that isolation, there was peace, a freedom from the demands of social interaction and the need to be productive, a permission to simply sit and be. The muscles in the neck and shoulders relaxed further, the tension melting away like ice in warm water, leaving the body feeling loose and heavy. The breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the sleeper in the bed, a synchronized respiration that bound the two figures together in the quiet room. The concept of the future seemed abstract and irrelevant, a distant land that might never be reached, while the present moment stretched out infinitely wide and deep. There was nothing to do, nowhere to go, nothing to achieve. There was only the sitting and the waiting and the breathing and the rain. The mind began to detach from the sensory inputs, floating in a space of semi-consciousness where thoughts were like clouds drifting across a summer sky, formless and fleeting. Images from the past surfaced and vanished, a face, a flower, a street corner, a melody, fragments of a life lived in a different time and a different place. The smell of baking bread, the feel of sun on the skin, the sound of laughter, memories that were warm and distant, like a dream remembered upon waking. But the reality of the room always returned, the cool air, the gray light, the ticking clock, the anchor that held the mind to the present. The thirst came slowly, a dryness in the throat that prompted a reach for the cup of water on the table, the ceramic cool and smooth against the hand. The water was tepid and tasted of iron, a flat taste that was strangely refreshing, washing away the dryness and bringing a moment of clarity. Placing the cup back on the table required a slow, deliberate movement, watching the coaster to ensure it was centered, a small act of order in a chaotic universe. The shadows in the corners of the room were lengthening, stretching out like long fingers reaching towards the center of the rug, merging with the darkness that was slowly filling the space. It was the time of day known as the gloaming, the twilight hour, when the boundaries between the visible and the invisible became thin, when the solid world seemed to dissolve into shadow. The furniture in the room lost its definition, the wardrobe becoming a dark monolith, the washstand a vague silhouette, the chair a shapeless mass. Only the bed remained distinct, a white island in a sea of gray, the quilt rising and falling with the breath of the sleeper. The sound of the rain changed again, becoming a softer hiss, a steady whisper that wrapped the house in a blanket of sound, muffling the world and protecting those inside. It was a sound that went deep into the brain, bypassing the conscious mind and speaking directly to the primitive need for shelter and safety. To be inside when it was raining outside was one of the most fundamental comforts of human existence, a confirmation of survival and security. The body sank deeper into the chair, the bones seeming to soften, the flesh becoming heavy, the connection to the physical world growing weaker. The line between waking and sleeping was blurring, a misty borderland where reality and dream intermingled. The pattern on the rug began to swim, the colors merging and shifting, the lines twisting and turning. The ticking of the clock seemed to slow down, the space between the ticks growing longer and longer, until each second stretched into an eternity. Tick, wait, tick, wait, tick. The rhythm was a slow pulse, a heartbeat of the house, a metronome for the soul. The mind let go of the need to make sense of things, let go of the need to categorize and label, let go of the need to think. There was only the sensation of being, the feeling of weight and warmth, and the sound of the rain. A deep drowsiness settled over the room, a heavy fog of sleep that was impossible to resist. The head nodded forward, the chin touching the chest, the eyes closing, not with a snap, but with a slow surrender. The darkness behind the eyelids was warm and inviting, a velvet void where there were no shapes and no colors, only peace. But a sudden noise from the street, a horse whinnying in the distance, startled the mind back to wakefulness, a momentary jolt that sent a ripple of adrenaline through the system. The eyes snapped open, taking in the dim room, the gray window, the sleeping figure. It was not yet time to sleep, not yet. The vigil must be kept. The body shifted in the chair, finding a new position, redistributing the weight, easing the stiffness in the joints. The hands rubbed the face, feeling the skin cool and dry, the friction generating a small amount of heat. The gaze returned to the window, to the rain, to the falling water. It was darker now, the purple of the sky turning to a deep bruised blue, the street lamps below beginning to flicker to life. The gaslight was a soft yellow glow, a warm beacon in the wet darkness, illuminating the falling rain like distinct streaks of gold. The lamplighter was nowhere to be seen, but his work was evident, the chain of lights stretching down the avenue like a necklace of pearls. The light reflected in the puddles on the ground, creating pools of gold in the sea of gray. It was a beautiful sight in a melancholy way, a scene of quiet desolation that was strangely moving. The world was asleep, or waiting to sleep, and the watcher in the window was the only witness to the transition. The thought of the night ahead was not frightening, but comforting. A long stretch of silence and darkness, a time for rest and recovery. The book on the knee slid to the floor with a soft thud, a sound that seemed loud in the quiet room, but did not disturb the sleeper. Leaving it there seemed like the right thing to do, a surrender to the entropy of the evening. The hands rested on the lap, palms up, open and empty, a gesture of receiving, of accepting whatever the night would bring. The breath was slow and deep, filling the lungs with the cool air, exhaling the tension. The mind was a still pool of water, reflecting the room, the rain, the night. No ripples disturbed the surface, no thoughts broke the calm. It was a state of pure existence, of simply being present in the moment. The history of the world was happening elsewhere, in the noisy capitals and the busy ports, but here, in this room, history was paused, held in suspension. The only history that mattered was the history of the breath, the history of the rain, the history of the healing body in the bed. And so the evening deepened, the shadows merged, the light faded, and the room settled into the long, quiet night. The atmosphere was thick with sleep, heavy with the accumulated silence of the day, rich with the promise of rest. The watcher sat, the sleeper slept, the rain fell, and the world turned slowly, silently, inevitably towards the dark. The walls of the room seemed to move closer, wrapping the occupants in a protective embrace, shutting out the cold and the wet. It was a fortress of solitude, a sanctuary of silence, a temple of sleep. And in that temple, the only prayer was the breath, the only hymn was the rain, the only God was the peace that comes with total surrender.